Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get started. I see a lot of new names on the list, so thank you for joining us. My name is Jody Bechtel. I'm the Deputy Director of Clark County's Department of Environment and Sustainability, and here today to talk about rule development for state implementation plan requirements for moderate non-attainment for the 2015 ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Okay, so Clark County's Division of Air Quality in the Department of Environment Sustainability serves as the air pollution control agency for Clark County. The contacts you see on the screen here are those that are involved in this ozone attainment state implementation plan process and rule development. We've had a series of stakeholders. Our very first stakeholder meeting on this new non-attainment designation was held on January 12th. This is the 7th of 7 workshops to review the particular regulations we are looking to promulgate for this moderate non-attainment designation. And for those of you who have been participating all along, this is the last time you'll have to hear me review these slides. These meetings are being recorded, so beware of that, and recordings can be found on our website. The link is shown at the bottom of the screen here. I will place that in the chat so you have easy access to that if you would like to pass that along or re-review the discussion. So we will have time during this meeting to address some of your questions. We're asking that you please hold any verbal questions until the end of the presentation. You are welcome to type them into the chat as they come to mind, and or you can also raise your hand, and at the end of the presentation we will kind of go through the list of questions as we are able to get to them. If we don't get to every question, we will do our absolute best to get answers back to you. So in our January meeting, we reviewed the ozone situation that we are facing here in Clark County. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail in these slides, but I do encourage you to watch the January 12th video or review that presentation for the specifics. We were in marginal non-attainment for ozone, and the current standard for ozone is 70 parts per billion. We have been bumped up to moderate non-attainment given that standard. This slide and on this graph shows kind of the trend of our ozone design value trends over the last 20 or so years for hydrographic area 212 or the Las Vegas Valley. And as you can see, our ozone levels have been trending downward, but since the early 2000s or so, as you can see, we're kind of stuck in that mid to low, excuse me, 70 parts per billion, and we need to get those numbers below 70 parts per billion to reach attainment. So this bump up in classification requires that we achieve attainment by August 3rd, 2024. We must establish emission control requirements in a state implementation plan, and that would also include rule development for reasonably available control technology requirements, or RACT, a 50% rate of progress requirement, as well as contingency measures. And under EPA's final bump up rule, EPA requires that the Division of Air Quality submit a state implementation plan, or SIP, by the retroactive date of January 1st, 2023. So because we are working under a deadline that has passed, we need to get controls in place as soon as possible, or we are at risk that the EPA could start a sanctions clock that could lead to loss of federal highway funds and other penalties. And it could also allow EPA to impose a federal implementation plan, or FIP, to implement control requirements and get us into attainment. So we've identified these source categories shown as bullets on your screen here. For needing action and for rulemaking. These actions and those on the next slide are the rules we're discussing in this series of workshops. We are additionally needing to show a 15% volatile organic compound emissions reduction over the baseline, or a rate of progress, ROP. These emissions are independent, or I'm sorry, these reductions are independent of emission reductions necessary to achieve attainment. So as well, we are required to have contingency measure rules on the books that would be triggered if we haven't reached attainment by 2024. So these are the actions being considered for the 15% ROP VOC reduction and contingency measures. So some of these you'll notice overlap with the CTG RACT actions and rules from the previous slide, and those overlaps will be discussed in these workshops. We expect and hope not to have to implement all of these actions, and we will know for certain which ones are needed for attainment once we have completed and run our attainment model. We expect that to be completed sometimes toward the end of April, so we'll have a better idea of which of these will need to be implemented and which of these would be contingency. We're discussing all of these rules with stakeholders during these workshops as if we were going to implement all of them given the tight schedule. And then this table here just shows the statutory timelines that we're working under. Again, EPA Region 9 is aware that the SIP submission deadline is in the past and retroactive, therefore it's unrealistic. DAQ is working closely with EPA to show good faith progress, and we're looking to adopt the regulations as expeditiously as possible in this year, 2023. We'll review the expected timelines for each of the rules that we're considering in these workshops, and the timelines are based on an attempt to get these rules in place by the summer months of 2023, which is kind of the peak of our ozone season when we have the most exceedances. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ted Lendis, who will discuss the rules discussed under this workshop today, which are related to gasoline.
Thank you, Jody. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last installment of our stakeholder workshop. Today, I'll be covering 3 separate rulemakings relating to gasoline. They are Stage 1 Vapor Recovery, CARB Enhanced Vapor Recovery, and the California Reformulated Gasoline. The topics we're going to cover today, as it relates to Stage 1 Vapor Recovery, we will do a brief overview of vapor recovery systems. We'll talk about the relevant regulations and some background associated with those. We'll also take a look at a crosswalk of the regulations.
Bless you.
I'm sorry? And with Enhanced Vapor Recovery, we'll do an overview, and then we'll discuss some implementation strategies. And then finally, with Reformulated Gasoline, once again, we'll do an overview of that. We'll take a look at the fuel specifications, and then again, we'll discuss some implementation strategies. Before we get started, I need to make one point of clarification. The sample rule that was circulated for your review about a week ago was labeled Section 52, which is our current gasoline dispensing regulation. However, the proposed rule will be assigned Section 102. Okay, so this presentation will refer to the proposed rule as Section 102, not to be confused with the current rule, which is Section 52, and hopefully that won't cause any confusion for you all. I know many of you in the audience today are intimately familiar with gasoline dispensing facilities, but for the benefit of those that may not be so familiar, we'll just go over a few of the fundamentals. Beginning with the definition of a gasoline dispensing facility. I'll read directly from the slide. This means any stationary facility which dispenses gasoline into fuel tank, motor vehicle engine, non-road vehicle, non-road engine, including non-road vehicle or non-road engines used solely for competition. These facilities include, but are not limited to, facilities that dispense gasoline into on and off-road, street or highway motor vehicles, lawn equipment, boats, test engines, landscaping equipment, generators, pumps, and other gasoline-fueled engines and equipment. Important to note here is that GDF is not only referring to your public street corner gas station. It includes all gasoline dispensing, including things such as speedways and golf courses and industrial and mining operations, as well as private fleet fueling areas. The vapor recovery system can be divided into two parts. Stage one refers to the part of the system that returns displaced vapors from the storage tank when being fueled by a tank truck. In California and some of the western states, this is also referred to as phase one, but stage one and phase one are synonymous. There's also a vent pipe that relieves pressure, both positive and negative pressure, within the storage tanks. And I consider this part as part of stage one, and you can see it circled in blue in this area right here. Finally, stage two vapor recovery systems, which is circled in green on the diagram, returns the displaced vapors from the vehicle to the portable tanks and portable tanks to the stationary tanks during the filling. There are several roles that have to be factored into this rulemaking. I have them listed here, and we'll discuss each of these in more detail in subsequent slides. The rules we'll be discussing begins with the control technology guideline, the stage one vapor recovery systems for gasoline service station, the 40 CFR Part 63, Subpart 6C, gasoline dispensing facilities. We'll go over AQR Section 52 in some detail. That's entitled The Handling of Gasoline at Service Stations, Airports, and Storage Tanks. And of course, we'll be discussing the proposed rule, Section 102, Gasoline Dispensing Facilities. So the CTG was issued back in 1975. This CTG addresses requirements for the control of gasoline vapors from what they call service stations, commonly referred to today as gasoline dispensing facilities. The CTG established an emissions control efficiency of 90%, and it identifies equipment and operating recommendations that qualify as presumptive RACT. In all cases that are subject to this CTG, the control of gasoline vapors during tank filling, again, stage one sources, is required at some level. CFR Part 63 is the national emission standard for hazardous air pollutants. And it was originally published back in 2008. There were several amendments after that. I've got those noted in parentheses there. I think I've captured them all. This applies to all existing and new gasoline dispensing facilities across the United States with various compliance dates, all of which have passed at this point. This establishes notification, controls, testing, and reporting requirements for GDFs, and it closely reflects the CTG RACT recommendations. The requirements in this rule are tiered based on monthly throughputs. More stringent requirements are applicable as monthly throughputs increase. Once the GDF is triggered, and once the requirements within a certain tier are triggered, the source remains subject to those requirements, regardless of whether those throughputs are reduced in subsequent years. AQR Section 52 was SIP approved on two separate occasions. The first time back in 1979, and then again in 1981. It was repealed by Clark County in April of 2011. And the thinking back then was that the federal NAAQS was sufficient enough to address gasoline dispensing, rendering Section 52 obsolete. Unfortunately, EPA denied Clark County's request to remove Section 52 from the SIP back in 2016 on the basis of backsliding under Section 110L of the Clean Air Act. So Section 52 remains in the SIP, but it's currently not being enforced by DAQ and has not since back in 2011 when it was repealed. Subsequent versions of Section 52, and some of you may recall that we had versions of 52 that came out after 1981. Those were never introduced into the SIP, and they're not really involved in this rulemaking. So one option in this rulemaking is to reinstate Section 52, but DAQ believes that this may not be a viable approach because there are gaps in the requirements when comparing Section 52 to the CTG and the NAAQS. Also, Section 52 doesn't align well with Clark County's current permitting structure. We pretty much overhauled the permitting structure back in 2010, and 52 as it was written decades ago doesn't really fit well with that. And we believe the Section 52 Stage 1 vapor recovery requirements need to be adjusted to address more practical enforceability. Because the proposed rule will be wholly modernized, and because Section 52 has such a history of revisions that were never introduced into the SIP, we want to eliminate any confusion by starting with a new regulation specific to the 2015 ozone SIP. So we'll spend a little bit of time on this slide. This is where all of these applicable requirements come together. We've talked about all the different rules that are in play during this rulemaking, and now we're going to look at how they overlap. Note that the proposed rule, Section 102, should be at least as stringent as all the current applicable requirements. As you may have figured out, the red X's on this table represent controls that are not addressed in the corresponding rule. Except for the last column, you'll note that each of these existing rules have at least a couple of controls that aren't included, whereas Section 52 across the bottom, Section 102, the proposed rule, that's across the bottom, will require all of these. For now, please focus on the first column for Stage 1 vapor recovery. One apparent difference is the trigger we're proposing for Stage 1 vapor recovery. In Section 52, it requires that all GDFs, as long as the tank capacities are larger than 250 gallons, that Stage 1 vapor recovery would have to be installed. And Subpart 6C doesn't require it until the monthly throughput meets 100,000 gallons per month. We're proposing that Stage 1 vapor recovery for gasoline throughputs that are equal to or greater than 10,000 gallons per month, which is still significantly more stringent than the NAAQS, and it aligns closely with what other jurisdictions have done with their rules in recent years. One reason is the original non-attainment area that was associated with Section 52 did not encompass the entire Las Vegas Valley. Because there's been significant growth in the valley since the promulgation of 52, we're expanding the applicability of Section 102 to a considerably larger geographic area. Also, the population of GDFs whose throughputs are below 10,000 gallons per month and therefore would not be required to install Stage 1 vapor recovery is insignificant when compared to the gasoline throughputs of larger GDFs that would have to install Stage 1 vapor recovery due to the proposed rule. Additionally, Section 102 will harmonize the NAAQS, the CTG, and Section 52 so that all of these gaps that you see on this table will be addressed. This will make Section 102 as stringent, if not more stringent, than each of these other rules alone. As a simple example, consider that Section 102 will require submerged filling for all tanks that meet the 250-gallon capacity threshold. Yet the NAAQS doesn't require that until throughputs reach 10,000 gallons per month. So DAQ believes this holistic approach to harmonizing all the gasoline dispensing requirements will ultimately result in controlling VOCs from GDFs more than Section 52 has in the past. And therefore, Section 102 is arguably more stringent. As a final point, before moving off this slide, Stage 2 vapor recovery, which is represented by the last column in this table, the last column off to the right, is not required for any of these rules. I know that's a point of interest specifically for many of the owner-operators, especially given that more recent versions of Section 52, again, those that were not included in the SIP, did require Stage 2 vapor recovery. That's not the case now, nor is it on the horizon at this time. So some additional considerations. You may have noticed in the sample rule that was circulated in advance for your review, it had a section for notification and permitting that was somewhat void of content. DAQ is considering how to regulate GDFs in accordance with AQR Section 102. When they fall below the current permitting threshold, which is for VOCs, a PTE of equal to or greater than 5 tons per year. Options include developing a registration program for GDFs that are currently not subject to permitting, or requiring all GDFs to obtain a permit pursuant to Section 12.1. Either approach would have to accomplish a means for us to track these VOC sources. We need to convey the applicable requirements to you all. There needs to be some compliance demonstration, and unfortunately, there needs to be fees associated to operate the program. A straightforward course of action would be that would satisfy all of these requirements would be to require permitting. But we want to hear whether stakeholders have experience working with registration programs in other jurisdictions that still check all the boxes. We're requesting comment on whether there are any advantages to either of these approaches based on your experiences. Now, are there any immediate questions that we could address now before I move on to enhanced vapor recovery? We'll have an opportunity to visit questions again towards the end.
This is Araceli, Ted, and I just want to let folks know that everyone's microphones have been disabled, but if you raise your hand, I can go ahead and enable your microphone and video so that you can unmute yourselves. So if there's any questions, please raise your hand or put them in the chat.
Thank you, Araceli. And again, there'll be an opportunity for questions when we get to the end. Okay, we'll move on. Like regular stage 1 vapor recovery, CARB Enhanced Vapor Recovery is a system designed to capture and recover gasoline vapor emissions that occurred during the filling of storage tanks. It's different from regular stage 1 vapor recovery in several key ways. CARB EVR is designed to be more efficient in capturing gasoline emissions as compared to regular stage 1 vapor recovery. EVR is designed to reduce VOC emissions by 98% compared to regular stage 1 at 90%. This is achieved through a more stringent certification process, as well as using improved vapor recovery equipment. Differences in CARB EVR equipment include rotating adapters for fill and vapor lines, integrated drain bucket, drop tube, and drain valves, specialized PV valves, and spill buckets for vapor adapters. CARB EVR is typically required only in areas that are most challenged by meeting ozone standards, which is why we're considering it here. Whereas, of course, stage 1, just conventional stage 1 vapor recovery is required throughout the United States. As Jody mentioned earlier, CARB EVR is a potential ROP and contingency measure. DAQ would only implement EVR if we fail to meet attainment dates or make reasonable further progress. In order to understand how this transition from regular stage 1 vapor recovery to EVR should occur, if necessary, DAQ is requesting comments on the time frame and the cost necessary to retrofit existing systems to comply with more stringent requirements, and also how impactful would they be on the construction of new GDFs. So the questions that we have relating to vapor recovery are, are there any aspects of the model rule for stage 1 vapor recovery and EVR that are outdated given modern technology? What are the advantages or disadvantages of permitting all GDFs opposed to permitting only those that meet the existing permitting thresholds, and having a registration program for the rest of the GDFs that fall out of permitting? And, what are appropriate exemption provisions for these rules? We'd like to know what a reasonable time frame is by which a GDF should be expected to upgrade an existing source to meet the requirements of EVR. And what are the costs associated with retrofitting existing sources and added costs for constructing new GDFs that are EVR compliant? So we're going to move on to reformulated gasoline. Reformulated gasoline is a type of gasoline that has been specifically blended to reduce ozone to reduce emissions of ozone precursors and air toxins. RFG achieves its reduction in ozone by reducing the Reid vapor pressure, preventing it from evaporating as quickly as conventional gasoline, and increasing the oxygen content, which promotes more complete combustion of VOC. RFG performs similar to conventional gasoline and really has no adverse effects on engine parts as far as we can tell. The use of RFG would apply to all gasoline-fueled on-road vehicles such as passenger cars, trucks, motorcycles, etc. It would also apply to non-road equipment, including all gasoline-fueled spark-ignited two-stroke, four-stroke engines used in construction, lawn and gardening, and commercial, and etc. So here's a side-by-side comparison of Clark County's fuel data next to CARB RFG data that was used in the modeling. Most notable, the RVP drops from 10 psi in Clark County's fuel from 10 psi down to 7.3 psi in the CARB formulation. You can see some other differences, but again, much of it really centers on the RVP pounds per square inch. So similar to EVR, RFG again is a potential ROP and a contingency measure. Conventional gasoline would be switched to RFG at commercial gas stations and fueling dispensing facilities that are located within the non-attainment area. RFG specifications for fuel dispensed in hydrographic area 212 would meet those of CARB's, the California RFG regulations during peak ozone season. Now, technically, our ozone season is the entire year, but we're most concerned about the time of the year when the formation of ozone is most prevalent. And those tends to occur between the months of April and September. RFG would be immediately usable for existing mobile sources that are fueled by conventional gasoline without any need of modification or replacement of the vehicle or parts. So the questions that we have relating to RFG, should areas within Clark County that are outside of the non-attainment area be exempted? Are there any other exemption provisions? Are there arguments supporting a requirement to dispense RFG throughout the year and not just during peak ozone season? And what are the logistical concerns and the timing requirements relating to the transition from conventional gasoline to RFG? Are there any technical considerations? You know, recall back a number of years ago when E85 was really gaining some traction. Well, we discovered that it had a lot of corrosive properties, which was problematic. I'm not aware of any similar issues relating to RFG, but we'd like to hear whether there is, in fact, anything that you're aware of. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. Are there any comments or questions that I can address now? And Araceli, if you want to take over the wheel.
Yes, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and I will disable your microphone so that you can unmute yourself or enable your microphone. And then also you can put them in the chat box.
I know there must be at least one question out there.
I was going to say, surely someone has a difficult question for Ted.
Okay, we have, let me see. Okay, Brad Falkins is asking, with RFG supply, should be looked at as as California has problems supplying themselves?
That's
Go ahead.
well, no, I mean that's an important consideration. Obviously, we do expect in the very near future to start initiating discussions with the respective pipelines, including the pipeline from California, of course, and just talk through those logistics. As one of the questions that I had posed earlier, we're asking what are these logistical concerns? Not only relating to the transitioning, but in the case of Brad's question here, is there adequate supply? So we need to have those talks. And Brad, I'm not sure where you fall in the industry, but we certainly are interested in starting those discussions with the suppliers and see what their thoughts are.
Ted, I'm going to go ahead and allow Brad access to his microphone so that his hand is raised. So bear with me one moment.
Of course.
Okay, Brad, you should be able to unmute yourself and speak.
Hey, good morning, all and Ted. So I'm with River City Petroleum. We're distributors here in the Las Vegas Valley. I also run 8 commercial fueling locations. So a bit on both sides of what you're talking here with attainment. So when it comes to especially RFG, right? California is the only one that makes that fuel, or it has to be imported from some refineries overseas that come in, and California is burning it. So part of the problem we just had last week, right, with the gasoline was that waivers had to be given so that non-attaining reed vapor pressure product could be brought into the valley. Aside from that, a decent portion of our gas product is coming in from Salt Lake City down to the Apex terminal. So that pipeline on a CARB basis, to my knowledge, I don't think Salt Lake has any thought process of making CARB style gasoline. Not even sure they can, right? So it seems like you would be greatly hindering the supply chain, at least without a lot of research. And certainly, if you look at pricing in California of what their gas pricing is, taxes being pretty close to the same in Clark County versus most of California, they run 60, 80 cents a gallon higher than us. So I don't know that would be the first one I would look at without real considerations for the supply chain.
So, Brad, when you say the first one, are you referring to the first, the formulation, or just in general RFG?
When I say the first, the first area to solve the overall ozone problem, right? So I would look at equipment and maintaining that probably before. I think the cost to Clark County residents would be higher overall with an RFG program for a year, with years of higher prices of fuel. And like I said, supply could be a problem again.
Understood. Would you be willing to recapture all of those points and send that to us in writing?
Yeah, I can do that.
And it can be informal. Just excuse me, email's fine, and we'll be providing everyone with that contact information. But the valid points, thank you for that. We're certainly looking for feedback exactly like that.
No problem. Thanks for the opportunity.
Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing anything else in the chat at this time, and I don't see any hands raised. We can give a couple, a few more moments.
And I'll guess if I'm still available on
Yes.
on equipment replacement for phase 2, the enhanced vapor recovery.
Yes.
So I guess part of the feedback there would be time considerations to saw cut concrete for spill buckets, right? For the 2-point. If there's not spill buckets on the vapor, equipment's hard to get these days, so swivel adapters might be a challenge, especially if all of the service stations in town, not all, but a significant portion probably don't have swivel adapters on their vapor. And those would be the issues too. And then I think your pressure relief valves currently are only tested if you're a phase 2 vapor recovery. You noted that the pipe is considered phase 1, at least in your thought process, and I don't believe in the county permitting process that may hold true.
Okay. I don't know if you had an opportunity to review the sample roll, but we included the testing for the PV in that roll, even though technically it addresses stage 1. So point, duly taken. But back to the supply of this equipment, would you say that, or the lack of supply, I should say, would you say that that's a product of the supply chain issues that we've had of recent, or just in general?
Well, I think supply chain recent, right? I think over the years. So, if you were to say implement it in the next year, I think it would be problematic. If it was a phase in over X number of years where supplies could be brought up and it can be determined how many of these are out there needed, then it's probably less of that function, and then more of a function of actually having qualified crews that can come in and do the work.
Right.
The piece of that I don't know is on the fill side and the integrated tube, drain plug, spill bucket. Same bit of issue if that requires replacements of the existing spill buckets we have. I'm not sure it does, but could run into the same type of issues there. A lot of those spill buckets are poured in concrete, or you have to actually cut the concrete to get them out and redo it versus a replacement system, and they both exist, but logistically, those would be some of the concerns with the number of companies we have in town, and honestly, the amount of work they're doing just to service what we have.
Right. And we do have a lot of gasoline stations in this town. From a permitting perspective, I can tell you that it makes up literally half of the stationary sources that we permit. So they are in the order of hundreds. And to one of your previous points, as far as qualifications, there is, from my understanding, there is a certification requirement to install EVR as opposed to conventional stage 1 vapor recovery. So there is that additional level of expertise, if you will, that would be required, and of course that could hamper the effort if we don't have that kind of stuff, that kind of experience and qualification here in Clark County. So again, good points. Thank you so much. And if you would include those.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say on your phase in, if you do look at that as a phase in, hopefully you take into account a Costco should be phased in before a Bob's Gas and Pump, that based on the quantity of gasoline that's going through them.
Sure. Yeah. That's going to take some creative thinking, but I would agree with you when you say that start with the bigger players and then ratchet down. The time frame is really a big question for us. What kind of time is necessary to cycle through all of these sources, given the resources that we have. And so if there's anyone out there, including yourself, Brad, that can offer some idea of whether we're talking in terms of, well, I mean, it's going to years, months, decades, whatever.
Yeah, I think your key there is reaching out to the companies that do that repair work, right? Be it Idaho, High Desert, Those are the two. Those are the two that come top of mind for me. But I know there's others out there, to include companies that are large enough to have their own, in-house teams that do that work. But those are the guys that would be able to tell you kind of workload level, equipment level, to give you a better idea of how to plan, at least put the plan out there. And I get the other end of it. I saw phase 2 vapor recovery get phased in, at one point and phased out at another. And we're talking about EVR now and electronic payment at the gas stations and how long it takes that to get put in. And honestly, service stations owners will wait till the last minute on anything. So that all has to be considered in the deadlines and planning.
Of course. Yes. Yes. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, Araceli, if you would bring us to a close.
Sure.
I do have that last slide if you want me to grab it
Oh,
a little fast.
That's okay. I can go ahead and share my screen.
Okay.
I'm sorry, one moment, please. Okay, so I'm sorry, hold on one moment, please. So as discussed earlier, given the timelines that EPA has placed on us, we're adopting a fast-paced schedule for implementing these rules. We need to adopt them so that they will take effect and produce emission reductions for the 2023 ozone season. We are aiming to implement these rules no sooner than July 4th, 2023. We would consider, given working with this timeline, we would consider all comments that were received today, as well as any other written ones that are received by March 1st. The proposed rule would then be released for a 30-day public notice. That would be on April 9th, followed by a public hearing, and then would go to the board on June 20th. That would be the Board of County Commissioners for final adoption, and the rule would become effective 14 days later on July 4th. And again, as I've said, this would be the soonest that they would be adopted. The next steps, this slide basically restates what I said in the previous slide. I just want to say that all of you who have registered for our respective distribution lists will receive updates on the development of these rules and of our attainment plan. You can follow the development of our plan using the link in this slide and that was provided in the chat box. And all of the information, the materials that were presented today and at past stakeholder meetings will be available on that webpage. And just in closing, I want to say that DAQ will continue to engage both industry and other interested parties in the development of our attainment plan. Questions can be directed to the contacts listed on this slide. I've posted that information in the chat. Comments on this rulemaking should be addressed to Alejandro Nunez, and he will go ahead and route that to Ted and the rest of the team working on these rules. And finally, again, if you wish to receive notices on plan developments and have not already signed up for our distribution list, you can email Alejandro and you will be added to it. And that's all I have for you. Does anyone else have anything to add?